Today is the 27th of February 2026, and on this day, 7 years ago, the world lost someone very special indeed, and I fear that by this point, many people who watch my videos might not even know his name. It's a name that I feel no one who is a fan of Top Gear should ever forget. That name is Alex Mills. Now, if you've been regularly watching the content I produce, you are no doubt at least partially aware of who this man was and his achievements. I've certainly brought him up more than a fair few times over the years. However, I've never really gone into detail with what it was that he did, and personally I find that a great shame because, and this is a point I'll reiterate at the very end of the video, the reason you are probably still enjoying Top Gear to this very day is directly the result of something Mills did over 2 decades ago, and I want a larger audience, many of whom might not have even been around in the early 2000s, to appreciate that. Sadly, I do feel that this tribute to a man who was larger than life will be unavoidably tainted by what I have to say over the next few minutes. What I'm about to say ties in very neatly to the overall message that I want this video to have, namely that the phenomenon of Top Gear at its peak went far beyond the capabilities of any individual host, producer, channel controller, or indeed scriptwriter. For any one of those entities to try and individually take the credit for all the success they enjoyed without acknowledging the peculiar alchemy that allowed them all to work together under the auspices of a very shrewd and dedicated fanbase would be to fundamentally misunderstand why Top Gear was so successful in the first place. Recently, though I'm not exactly sure how recently, a rather bold claim was put forth by a certain individual that the reason no one liked Chris Evans' brief tenure as Top Gear host wasn't because of his attitude, his questionable driving ability, general wheel knowledge, his pride for accomplishing something he didn't rightfully earn, how relentlessly the BBC tried to shove him down our throats, or his inability to control his temper online, but rather his wealth. That because everyone, quote-unquote, knew he was rich, and that was ultimately the reason he failed in his stint as Top Gear presenter, not any of the other hundreds of very valid reasons he completely sucked. And for a short time I was contemplating making a full-length video response to this claim because of just how objectively wrong it is, and then after about a minute or more of internal monologuing, decided against it, because the reason none of us liked Chris Evans can, quite frankly, be summed up perfectly in just 4 words. He was a twat. It doesn't need any more elaboration than that. People didn't like him because he was just so naturally unlikable. Rich or not, if you've got a face that's practically tailor-made for punching bags, frolic around the studio as though you've got a turtle head making a mad dash for the exit, disrespectfully liken your predecessors to characters from a children's TV show, crash out online at the earliest given opportunity, and in general possess less charisma than an ironically named 1990s Mitsubishi saloon, then just about no one is going to like you. Suggesting it was anything at all to do with Evans being rich trivializes the sheer amount of universal contempt the Top Gear fanbase held for him. It trivializes how desperately the BBC tried to make him work despite never having fronted a car program in his entire life, by claiming that he was more profitable for the BBC than Clarkson, but in the end, even they could see he was utterly hopeless. Now I'd keep going, but I get the feeling that I'm preaching to the choir here. My full opinion on how the BBC completely failed Top Gear beyond 2015 can be seen in this video that millions of you have already watched, and continue to watch, but to sum the whole thing up, even more than the fact that Chris Evans was simply an all-round w***er that nobody liked, after the events of March 2015, people just really wanted a face to hate after Clarkson wisely told everyone to leave Oshin Tiemann alone. The fact is, it wouldn't have mattered who the BBC got. The fans would still have by and large rejected them, because this was a matter of principle. This was Top Gear by committee. This was a Top Gear that Tony Hall had helped Frankenstein into being. This was a Top Gear in a world where literally the worst people you know had won. You can't build a successful TV show if its very foundation happens to be rotten to the core. Chris Evans not being successful during his short stint as Top Gear lead presenter because he was rich is such a downright ignorant, Anglo-centric, and above all else contemptible take because it's quite simply not true, and is purposefully overlooking the far bigger picture, all the while serving to delegitimize the reasonable critiques that were levied against him by a fanbase who felt betrayed. It also glosses over just how little Chris Evans was actually known outside the UK at the time, to the point only British viewers would have really known or cared about his underlying wealth and fame. Furthermore, as car enthusiasts, we tend to like Jay Leno in spite of the fact he's rich. We tend to like Harry Metcalf in spite of the fact he's rich. We even tend to like Tax the Rich in spite of the fact that, well, he's rich. But we tend to hate the Sultan of Brunei because he's a serial human rights violator who treats rare cars like worthless trinkets. To me, such arguments are on the same level of pointlessness and frivolity as debating the semantics as to whether or not Eddie Jordan was considered part of the main Top Gear presenting team, because it's fairly obvious that the BBC did. Even so, arguing that he wasn't is like arguing that the Devil 16 would have been the fastest car in the world simply because its engine turned out to be real. It's comically missing the main point of the argument. Ergo, this video is going to be on something a little different than my usual productions. It's going to demonstrate how one man, Alex Mills, who despite having zero connection to Top Gear or the BBC at all, ended up having perhaps the biggest impact on the show out of anyone who ever worked on it, before his story has the chance to be forgotten or historically revised. Because although it was tragically cut short by the same demonic force that is currently threatening Julia Bradbury, and has also robbed us of the likes of Richard Burns, Sabina Schmitz, the aforementioned Eddie Jordan, and most recently Quentin Wilson, it proved no less remarkable than any one of those lives. But before we start to focus on Mills's life proper and what exactly it was he did for Top Gear that was so significant, we're going to start by talking about the history of unlicensed media redistribution. In a word, piracy. Up until the introduction of the Betamax in 1978, the only real way you could watch shows on television was to simply watch them live. You missed them, that was purely on you, and you probably weren't going to be given more than a second chance to watch them. By the 1980s, advances in home recording technology meant you'd usually be caught up with the shows you had missed within a couple of days, although in one unfortunate case it turned out to be quite a bit later. If YouTube user Shazash is to be believed, in September 1989 he'd find himself in the market for a new Mercedes SL and wanted to see what Top Gear thought of it in what would turn out to be the very first road test from a then 29-year-old Jeremy Clarkson. Unfortunately, Shazash would miss this episode, and the next chance he got to watch it would be in August 2019 through an upload on Betaman's YouTube channel, very nearly 30 years to the day of its original broadcast, or Clarkson's entire lifespan up to the point that film was first made. Ah well, better late than never. Later still, you could often buy a few choice episodes and compilations of your favourite TV shows on VHS, but the concept of a boxed set of every episode in a series was almost alien. Sure, some of them existed, but at that point in time your money was far better invested in a stack of your own videotapes and a subscription to a satellite service in order to catch the specific reruns you desired. In the UK, we were pretty much spoiled for choice on that front thanks to the creation of UK Gold in November 1992, the first of several UK TV channels, and within a handful of years, more or less everything that was broadcast on the BBC would eventually find itself repeated on one or more of their sister stations every single day, including UK Drama, UK Style, Play UK, and perhaps most notably in the case of this video, UK Horizons. As the 90s progressed, other networks would set up their own channels to get in on the action, such as ITV2, BBC Choice, and BBC Knowledge, now known as BBC 3 and 4 respectively, with Channel 4's equivalent, E4, debuting in 2001. Recording programs which aired on these networks was a relatively easy feat, but there were two teething problems. Due to VHS being an analog format, recordings were never quite one-to-one and would deteriorate if stored improperly, damaged, or overplayed, with some unavoidable quality loss from the onset of recording, which then intensified in subsequent re-recordings, and this latter issue was especially important if you wanted other people to see what you recorded. But then, in 1996, the DVD launched, and it changed everything. Not only was the format significantly more compact, lightweight, and durable than the clunkier analog videotape it replaced, but it was also a digital format, meaning it was possible to directly transfer the footage stored on it to a computer without requiring specialist equipment, which then allowed you to create a perfect one-to-one backup, and from there, the world was your oyster. That 10-year period from 1996 until 2006 then saw a massive, unparalleled shift in media consumption and availability, as well as a massive increase in piracy that came hot on the heels of CD, cassette tape, and earlier floppy disk copying, much to the shared annoyance of rights holders worldwide. Suddenly, there were new means to access media without the need for shed loads of storage, deep pockets, or an encyclopedic knowledge of your TV guide, and 2002 was slap bang in the middle of this cultural revolution. Personal computers had become much more accessible and cheaper than they'd ever been before, with over half the UK now having access to the internet, and it wasn't long before many of them discovered that you could send and receive videos for free, with Emule in particular being one of the more popular choices in the days before torrenting took off. What compounded this shift in particular is that for the many series which weren't available on home video, it became possible to go one step beyond what a mere VCR or DVD could have allowed, provided you had enough storage space on your computer and the technological know-how to take it apart. Throughout the late 1990s into the early 2000s, Europe began adopting the DVB terrestrial standard, and it wouldn't take long before it was discovered how to capture these signals. Suddenly, pirates were no longer bound by the lo-fi analog limitations of VHS anymore. They would instead buy TV tuner cards manufactured by companies such as Hopage, fit them to their computer via the PCI Express slot, and from there directly record the transmissions as they were broadcast, cutting out the middleman entirely. This became even easier if you owned a media-oriented PC, as programs such as Windows Media Center 2005 even came with their own set-top box peripheral designed to plug into your computer and record live TV. Just imagine a company like Microsoft marketing something like that nowadays. But I digress. As this recording revolution was happening, internet forums were flourishing, especially ones centered around cars, and on many of these forums there would be an FTP. For younger viewers, think a shared Google Drive, on which people could host any videos they wanted. And on these forums there would be one TV show that routinely entertained these people and attracted the most views, even in the days before the program's 2002 relaunch. That program was BBC's Top Gear. Once it did return in 2002, with its most fondly remembered host back at the helm, interest in the program skyrocketed, and visitors, particularly Americans who were perhaps not as intimately familiar with the British motoring scene or its TV programs and personalities, found themselves hopelessly hooked in short order, and it was quite easy to see where the attraction lay. An entire hour of TV dedicated to the car that they had never seen before. And these videos became such a hit to the point their popularity soon dwarfed the rest of the websites in which they were hosted, let alone their FTPs. But all this ceaseless altruism came at a tremendous cost: bandwidth. Internet users would flock in their thousands to these forums, many of them unregistered lurkers, and this surge in traffic would put such a tremendous strain on these website servers that they'd often end up going offline. But it was one clip in particular, one which showed Jeremy Clarkson absolutely thrashing the Koenigsegg CCA test by the scruff of its neck, which became so popular on its own it was impossible to avoid on video sharing FTPs. People loved the style of Top Gear's presentation, even if the car manufacturers and classic car owners who lent their cars to the program were often less than enthused. Nowhere else in the world could you see a car worth £250,000 being slid around an airfield as though it was some old land barge with a welded diff. Eventually, the popularity of Top Gear clips on car forums drew so much traffic that it necessitated the creation of a whole new forum, one exclusively dedicated towards Top Gear, and could keep up with the rabid demand for more clips and episodes as time progressed. And so, on the 21st of September 2003, 1 month before the premiere of Top Gear's third series, what is quite possibly the most important website in the history of Top Gear would be founded: Final Gear, although it wasn't called that at this point in time. The website, focusing on Top Gear and its immediate rival Fifth Gear, was in time a tremendous success, but it didn't all come overnight, and to find out why, we need to go back to the online Wild West that was the early 2000s, a time when the scene reigned supreme. Alex Mills would be born on the 28th of July 1984. Growing up in 1990s Portland, Oregon, you might think that he was well outside the purview of what you'd consider the quintessential Top Gear fan. Throughout Mills's childhood, he'd find himself captivated through a triumvirate of computers, James Bond, and fast cars, with the Dodge Viper becoming his favourite. And so, when he got access to the internet for the first time in the 1990s and needed to come up with a pseudonym for his AOL account, there was naturally only one name on his pubescent mind: Viper 007 Bond. It was a pseudonym he'd end up sticking with for his entire life. As he drifted between online communities as those who grew up on that era of the internet often did, he'd eventually end up a regular at fastautos.net, developing a friendship with the British scene rip of the UK. Those words don't particularly mean all that much anymore, so I'd like to try and explain what they mean before the sands of time erode them completely. The wares scene has been around about as long as the internet has, and ultimately derived its name from the illicit sharing of paid software during the pre-Web 1.0 days, such traders likening themselves to drug peddlers. As this scene grew, it split off into hundreds of different offshoots all around the world, many of which would define the way the internet evolved and functioned decades later, inadvertently pioneering many aspects we now take for granted without ever realizing the role piracy had in their inception. Without the MP3 scene, for instance, there wouldn't be such a thing as iTunes or Spotify, although perhaps in the long run that wouldn't necessarily have been such a bad thing. And without the original wares scene, you wouldn't have Steam or similar gaming-as-a-service platforms, although once again the merits of what this has wrought in the long run are certainly debatable. But by the turn of the millennium, video game piracy had largely stopped being about roving squadrons of hackers and phreakers and had regressed to much smaller modding groups or even individuals who simply provided no CD patches or similar hacks. As a result, the scene would start to shift away from cracking video games in order to focus more on general media types that were harder to come by on the internet, chiefly professional software, music, movies, and television. And if you look around on the internet, you'll still find bits and pieces of old scene rips made many hundreds of moons ago to this very day, like some wartime relics that millions pass by every day completely unaware of their history. If you've ever seen a clip or even so much a YouTube poop of the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, for instance, then you've almost certainly seen footage of a scene rip originating from the British digital television station Trouble, as opposed to a DVD or other high-fidelity rip. Because scene rips were often the quickest, most readily available way to watch a show in the days before streaming, especially in situations where a boxed set didn't yet exist, and uncompressed video files were unwieldy anyway, both for smaller hard drives and less compatible codecs, as well as slower video cards. This in turn made them the ideal choice for montages and similar projects, as they were low in file size and could be run on most machines without any real trouble. Without having been a part of the scene myself, this is roughly all I feel qualified to talk about, especially given that it too is not the intended focus of this video, merely one of several parts that need to be addressed individually in order to be understood as one coherent whole. What does any of that have to do with Top Gear? Because the UK was a member of such a scene, and in fact lived almost exactly 5,000 miles away from Alex Mills in a place called Grays in Essex. And when he and Mills got to chatting online one day in the October of 2003, the topic of Top Gear inadvertently came up. When Mills expressed positive interest in the show, Vuk's response was, "Oh, I'll start ripping and sending you things." And this is the point our next tangent begins. Because you see, early rips of Top Gear were very low quality and inconsistent at best, mainly because the internet just wasn't yet ready to host entire series of programs. Mills himself even likened them to postage stamps in terms of their resolution and clarity or lack thereof, when speaking to Steph Schrader for Jalopnik 13 years later. Through repeated friskings of obscure internet directories and people who were there at the time, some of these earliest Top Gear recordings have survived, including the very first clip of 2002-era Top Gear ever uploaded to the internet, the often mislabeled Lamborghini vs Honda shootout from the very first episode, posted to the internet by real-world Ferrari and Lamborghini owner Eamon, or Jabba355 as he was more commonly known by. Throughout late 2002 and the first half of 2003, more and more clips of this show gradually made their way to the internet, and these clips came from a whole variety of sources. Sometimes you'd get the original airings, other times you'd get a reshowing from UK Horizons, and other times you'd get a BBC World broadcast from across the globe. And as demand for these clips continued to soar, the next logical step was therefore providing a means to access the original uncut episodes. The first 2 episodes of Top Gear are not known to have ever been recorded by anyone prior to 2005. There was of course a VHS recording of the first episode submitted to the BBC Redux archive that powers Box of Broadcasts, but that didn't come until many years later and wasn't publicly available until I made it so in the early 2020s. For a time, it actually seemed that Series 1 Episode 3 was cursed. Its first release would come from Jabba's recording of a 2003 UK Horizons re-airing, except due to bad header data, the episode would refuse to play beyond the 31-minute mark. I was able to use Google Drive to repair this file in 2020, but at the time such fixes weren't readily available. The second rip of this episode, made in 2005 by Makshuka, was also similarly fraught. Although he typically used a DVR to record his episodes so they were relatively lossless, it somehow failed, forcing him to resort to a VHS backup. Were it not for this decision, most people would not have been able to watch this episode in full and in high quality until 2008. The remaining 7 episodes of Series 1 were then largely made available through Jabba's World from a variety of recordings he himself had made during their original rebroadcast run on UK Horizons, and from what I could surmise, tapes that other users had sent Eamon's way. This was at least the case for episodes 7 and 8, which came from original BBC Two broadcasts of the episodes. Episodes 4, 9 and 10, likely among others, came from UK Horizons, the former eventually replaced in 2006 by an original BBC Two recording from scene member Altruist, which included scenes of Jeremy Clarkson reminiscing over the 1979 French Grand Prix, and Richard Burns discussing his autobiography and accident at the 2002 Rally New Zealand, both of which would be deleted in subsequent airings. It should also be mentioned that the UK Horizons recordings of episodes 3 and 4 are important from a Top Gear historian's perspective, namely because they contain what I strongly believe to be an earlier version of the Top Gear introduction sequence than would ever originally air, although that again is a topic for another video. By the time Series 2 rolled around, Jabba 355 in particular would commit himself to record every single episode as they aired on BBC Two, albeit with the caveat of putting his massive watermark across them, which became even monstrously longer when the crazy Hawaiians Broadcast Network, whoever they were, decided to sponsor themselves. A lot of people hated this, quite understandably, and as soon as Makshuka got round to ripping the second series himself, the majority of them would be promptly thrown out in favour of these higher quality rips, despite possessing 90 minutes worth of footage that wasn't available anywhere else. It would end up taking years and the dedicated efforts of people such as myself and Jay Sutherland to try and track down what remained of these films, but on our own we were relatively hopeless. In the end, it would take until 2021 before BBC iPlayer finally released the original as-broadcast versions of Series 2 of Top Gear, albeit with the exception of course to episodes 7 and 9, as all references to Stuart Hall's film on the Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud, barring a several-second clip during the end credits, would be deleted in light of his predatorial past. When it came to Series 3 of Top Gear, however, things would be a little bit different, because by this point, the UK knew that Mills was interested in the programme, and crucially possessed the means to record and distribute the episodes online from the day they were first broadcast, owing to his presence in the scene. This was mutually beneficial in several ways, chiefly that Mills would be able to get the episodes as soon as they came out in the UK, uncut and with 0 watermarks. Now, although we sadly don't know for sure, I personally believe that fateful night between Viper and VUK did not occur until some point after the 26th of October for one simple reason. VUK did not possess a rip of Series 3's first episode. In fact, outside of private Usenet groups, it seems no one did. Upon doing further research, Mills would indeed later clarify for the website's 10th anniversary in 2013 that he knew for certain it was late in the month, which gives us 5 likely dates, the 27th of October through to Halloween. What Alex Mills had achieved that night was something quite extraordinary indeed. Through the power of the internet, a lifelong friendship 5,000 miles in distance had been forged. But this was only the beginning. Tracking down the early history of Final Gear is hard, not only because it wasn't written down until many years later, but because it was a website that started out as Alex Mills' personal blog. In the beginning, it wasn't really a website that focused on Top Gear at all, rather the daily goings-on of a young web developer based in Portland and the things he stumbled upon that he felt others would be interested in. As a result, there isn't really a clear date that one could definitively point to as the day that Final Gear was unequivocally founded. The earliest date one could consider as the date that Final Gear launched is the 15th of August 2003, as that was the day Viper 007 Bond would go online for the first time, but it would take until the 18th September, a full month later, before he made the first move to set up an FTP, and another 3 days after that before the date that Mills would choose to commemorate as the founding of Final Gear as per his forum's join date. On the 29th of October 2003, at the age of 19, Mills would start his first job as a trolley pusher at a branch of Fred Meyer's after being hired 1 week earlier. Within 2 months, he'd be fired. Needless to say, it was a job he didn't care all that much for. He would be positively knackered after a grueling 4-hour shift of pushing shopping carts that first day, and after a week on the job decided that the best way to blow off some steam was to take a trip down Stark Street, site of the former City Limit strip club, with 4 of his closest friends. Mills' site fastly became a popular stop for those who wanted to watch Top Gear online, as you didn't need any complicated software to grab the episodes, nor did you really have to wait beyond what your router was naturally capable of. It was therefore decided on the 26th of November 2003 that Alex Mills would split this part of his website off into a brand new subdomain, which at the time was only titled Gear. Not that many people were able to access it for those first few days without a username and password, mind you, as Mills would once more find himself approaching his bandwidth limit for the month. He'd consequently reopen his FTP on a full-time basis starting from the 30th, but it would only last until the 6th December before once more being shut down. And part of the reason he'd struggled to keep it consistently online during the early days was because he only offered direct file downloads, which quickly ate up a lot of bandwidth. Once that bandwidth had been exceeded, the website would naturally go offline. On the final day of January 2004, Mills' website would come back online for the umpteenth time, and just 2 days later, he'd win an entire year's worth of web hosting due to entering a competition held at his web host's own forums. On the 24th of February 2004, Alex Mills would choose to participate in the Grey Tuesday Consumer Revolt, another topic that really merits its own video as it was one of the first times where the limits of copyright infringement over the internet was truly tested. Our story here begins in the days and weeks immediately following the release of Jay-Z's Black album in November 2003. Throughout the following 2 months, American DJ Danger Mouse would take the vocal stems from Jay's album and splice them with sampled instrumental tracks from the Beatles' White Album, hence the name. Needless to say, the bigwigs at EMI weren't happy to say the least. This was in spite of the fact that both Jay-Z and the 2 surviving members of the Beatles each independently gave their blessings to Danger Mouse's production. Because of this move from EMI, which attempted to halt the release of the album, and who many felt vastly overstepped the company's boundaries in protecting its copyright, an activist group called Downhill Battle made the decision to orchestrate an internet-wide rebellion, defending what Danger Mouse had made as a valid example of fair use. Several hundred different websites would partake in Grey Tuesday, where all you had to do was turn your website grayscale for the day, with 170 of them taking the extra step of hosting a pirated copy of the album, through the means of which over 100,000 copies are said to have been illegally downloaded. And if you were to visit Grey Tuesday's website that day and scroll all the way down to the bottom, you will indeed see Viper 007 Bond's website among the many sites listed as actively participating. On the 8th of March 2004, 2 weeks after Grey Tuesday, Alex Mills would once more recommit to launching his Top Gear website. Upon the main part of the website's launch, he'd make sure every user who wanted to access the download section of the website agreed to a disclaimer that you would neither sue Mills nor link to the episodes from elsewhere, which was a problem in the early days. Throughout April, Mills would study PHP in order to make as robust a web interface as possible, announcing on the 25th that it had become his main project, and by the 30th, he announced that the website had been fully converted to HTTP-only downloads, which in theory allowed the download of Top Gear clips and episodes directly from Mills' servers. In practice, it only worked for a handful of days. This is because on the 3rd of May, all of the files would randomly disappear from the server. 5 days later, it would be confirmed that although the server could support the intense bandwidth it was being subjected to, Mills' host objected to it and locked his account. Mills would therefore announce a return to sharing torrents of each Top Gear episode, finally regaining access to his file dump 2 days later. For the next 2 months thereafter, things were relatively plain sailing. The original episode of Top Gear or Fifth Gear would air in the UK, the UK would record them via his computer, and then communicate directly with Mills in order to facilitate their distribution, posting them to the internet in torrent form days later for a user base that had rapidly grown to thousands and then tens of thousands. It was the 19th of July 2004 when the first real problems occurred. One of the trackers that Mills was using on 3 of his episode torrents had changed the port it used, rendering them undownloadable. He'd fixed this issue by giving them new trackers, but 1 month later 6 further episodes would be made unavailable due to issues with other trackers, and on the last day of August, disaster struck, as the website which hosted all of the trackers Mills was using went down, taking basically all of the episodes that had been uploaded since the end of 2003 with it. He'd post a forum thread announcing this issue, and those who had signed up to the website simultaneously expressed their displeasure and support. It was during this time that Alex Mills keenly realised he needed to start all over again, and on the 31st of August, the same day as all the episodes went down, he announced that work had begun on a new version of his Top Gear website. This would take quite a while, so during the intervening months between its development and eventual deployment, he'd make sure the downloads kept flowing. That October, he'd take time out to make sure all of his torrents had functioning trackers as the 5th series of Top Gear hit the airwaves. Once more, things seemed to have calmed down, and people were happily downloading and sharing the episodes. But November 2004 would prove to be his website's toughest month yet, and it wasn't down to anything that was Mills' fault directly. On the 25th of November 2004, Thanksgiving of all possible days, Alex Mills would wake up to see his website gone. He'd quickly get in contact with HostRocket, the company which at that point was responsible for hosting Mills' website, expecting to hear of some piracy-related violation that had cost his account. He'd instead receive a response from David Lauby, who apologised profusely for the mix-up, stating that Mills' account was mistakenly deleted and credited him with 2 months of free web hosting, albeit with the caveat that Mills would then have to re-upload all of his website's data all over again. Not to worry on that front, as Mills had already taken the precaution of regular offline backups, but it was still a massive blow, and it came on more or less the worst possible day. Service would be restored 1 day later, seemingly without any styling whatsoever, and the blog would likewise return to working order by early December. In the meantime, as development on Final Gear continued, a temporary camp would be set up on the oddly named Diesel Station forum, which Mills was a regular member of, as the website's forum would take longer to restore than other parts. This would be their home for the next couple of weeks. On the 20th of December 2004, Mills could sense his group had outstayed their welcome, and started looking for a new URL to rebrand his upcoming website to. The first few ideas were relatively uninspired, but at 6:54 AM on the 21st, a member by the name of Overheat, based in the UK city of Bradford, would seemingly spend all night going through the top 3,000 URLs up for sale, which contained the word gear in the name. Of those 3,000, he'd shortlist 21 he liked the sound of the most, and it was the 13th of these, Final Gear, which other members of Mills' estranged cult immediately liked the ring of. Most members anyway. Of all the names, Final Gear made a considerable amount of sense, given the 2 TV shows it would primarily focus on were named Top Gear and Fifth Gear, which at the time at least were names considered largely synonymous with one another. In most cars, the Fifth Gear was often the Final Gear or Top Gear. It didn't show preference to either program, was less than 10 characters long so it was easy to type and remember, and crucially didn't mention anything that might have got Mills in trouble, i.e. anything to do with torrenting. Now of course, Mills thought otherwise. His personal preferred domain names were top5gears.com, an admittedly much more clumsier portmanteau, or geardownloads.com, which again hinted more towards hosting pirated content. Ultimately, it would be held to a vote on the Diesel Station forums on the 22nd of December, and over the following 5 days, 77 people would cast their vote. 20 votes would be split between Top 5 Gear and Top 5 Gears, whereas 17 votes went to Mills' preferred Gear downloads. But of all the names, Final Gear had that special ring to it, and won by a margin of over 26 votes despite fierce competition from its immediate rivals. But it doesn't take a genius to figure out that the name Final Gear was a winner. On the evening of the 27th, Alex Mills would therefore buy his new domain at finalgear.com, with a post from user UltraCoolDude the deciding vote. I can picture the title graphic for Final Gear. It's a gearbox with 5th gear, then Top Gear, and an extra slot for Final Gear. And so, Final Gear it was. The forums would come back online on the 30th just in time to see out the end of the year, and by the beginning of January 2005, a test version of the website would be rolled out. Mills would end up spending much of the early spring of 2005 hopelessly hooked on the then newly launched Gran Turismo 4, which released in the US on the 22nd of February. He was particularly an ardent fan of the newly introduced photo mode feature, which hadn't been seen before in the Gran Turismo franchise. Oddly, although his photos did incorporate a full gamut of cars he'd use in his career mode, none of them would be of a Dodge Viper, despite the GTS, GTSR race car, and SRT10 being in the game. On the 10th of March 2005, lightning would strike twice, as Mills would yet again win another year of free web hosting, although he himself desperately wanted the first place prize of a brand new gaming laptop. This perhaps served as motivation to getting the website done and dusted, and by the 21st, Final Gear had officially entered public beta. Over the next week, himself and Macedonian web designer Zero Signal, aka Beast, would get to work on finalizing the website and preparing it for its eventual deployment. It would end up taking almost a whole month before this occurred, and a mere 3 days before the website's official launch, another website known as TV Torrents would be taken down. Regardless, Final Gear would officially launch on the 24th of April 2005, and in its very first day back in full running order for the first time in almost half a year, the website would exceed the maximum server load, no thanks in part due to being the same day as an episode of 5th Gear aired. To that effect, starting from the 5th of May 2005, that's 050505, a countdown timer would be set up to let users know exactly when a new episode of their favourite show was going to be airing. The summer of 2005 would prove yet again a rather difficult time in Alex Mills' life. On the 12th of May 2005, BTEFnet, one of the major players of online torrents, would be one of many piracy-aligned websites that were firmly in the MPAA's crosshairs, and this immediately affected Final Gear given that it was used to primarily host new episodes of Top Gear and 5th Gear. Its domain would be seized, and those who tried to use the site as normal would instead be given the usual threatening letter. Meanwhile, on the 23rd of May 2005, Final Gear would launch the final version of its infamous black, white and red colour scheme, along with the classic, closely kerned typeface which many would jokingly refer to as Anal Gear. But with the MPAA's crackdown on internet piracy in full effect, it wasn't long before Final Gear would be targeted too, and on the 27th of May, the website would be directly hit with takedown requests apparently originating via the website's ISP, EV1 servers. The immediate prognosis was grim, and in response, all links of new Top Gear and 5th Gear episodes were immediately taken down post-haste. 2 days later, Cuban Cedar would move the entire website over to his server in an attempt to negate the takedown request, but this didn't work, as on the 1st of June 2005, the website would finally be the direct recipient of a cease and desist order from the BBC themselves, who in actual fact had sent the original cease and desist letter to EV1, as per the date in the email that Alex Mills and team member Pulse would receive. This greatly displeased Final Gear's user base, with Italian member Fritzy Pazzi sending the BBC a disparaging email in turn. On the 3rd of June, they would respond to Fritzy Pazzi in a much more informal manner, detailing exactly what it was they wanted doing.
Dear Mr. Pazzi, thank you for your email to the BBC. I am sorry you were unhappy with the BBC's decision to stop further downloads of the Top Gear programme. If I may explain, the BBC has not asked for the site to be closed down, merely that the downloads section be removed. The site finalgear.com is primarily intended for and used by non-UK residents. Those who live in the UK are able to watch Top Gear on a regular basis, as long as they own a TV license. Non-license fee payers do not have a right to see any BBC programme unless it is provided by a legitimate source. The BBC is funded by UK residents and depends on sales of programs overseas to continue the high level of program investment. It would simply be unfair on the license fee payers if the non-payers were able to watch BBC programs also. I recognise your frustration, but even if the program does not air outside the UK, that is no defence for offering unauthorised downloads. Thank you for taking the time to contact us with the strength of your concerns. Regards, BBC Information.
And if that email sounded strangely personal to you, you're not the only one. It's known that the BBC had their own eyes and ears actively monitoring the website for a good while, as on the 4th of January 2005, a member known as bbc.co.uk/topgear would create an account, and would roughly post once every 2 days. His account motto implied that this individual was the webmaster of the official BBC Top Gear website, and his posting habits would certainly add credence to that notion. We know this account had verifiable ties to the BBC, as that September, it would openly discuss the ticket sales for the studio tapings of the upcoming 7th series, information no one else could have possibly known at the time. You'll see in a short while, but there is one person who was almost certainly the individual behind this account, and possibly that email as well, and it's a name all of you are familiar with. Not that one. By the end of 2005, it was determined that Top Gear was the most illegally downloaded TV program in the United Kingdom, with over 96,355 downloads, putting it ahead of Desperate Housewives and South Park. 4 years later, in a study conducted by Big Champagne, every single episode of Top Gear would be downloaded in excess of 300,000 times within days of its original UK broadcast, and although around 10,000 of these downloads would still originate from within the British Isles, representing 4% of all downloads total, a whopping 150,000 of them, 47%, came from the United States. Now, the reason for the UK's rapid decline of Top Gear piracy is quite simple. In December 2007, the BBC would launch iPlayer, which provided the British public with a free and perfectly legal means to watch and download their favourite BBC programmes, no strings attached. But in the US, there wasn't such a thing, and Final Gear was no doubt the main driving force behind Top Gear's rampant piracy epidemic. In the meantime, Final Gear would proceed to have a rather quiet 2006, with very little happening for those first 3 or 4 months. That April, Pumster would continue to go through his old collection of tapes, digitizing a ton of episodes of old Top Gear from the 1989 to 1993 period, many of which you have no doubt seen over the years. When Top Gear did return that May, the UK would decide to experiment with making Series 8 available at 320p, which made the files come out at 425 megabytes as opposed to the typical 350 megabytes. 2 weeks later, Alex Mills would finally make the effort of beginning to write up the history of Final Gear, given that it had been online for 2.5 years by that point, but other than continue to follow the program, there wasn't much else to do. That all changed on the 20th of September.
The BBC's Top Gear presenter, Richard Hammond, has been seriously injured in a car crash.
After crashing at 280 miles an hour. He was driving a jet-propelled car at an airfield near York as part of a land speed record attempt programme.
The consequences could be fatal.
The fact that he'd try absolutely anything once may have been the reason that he's overstepped the mark a bit.
Thousands of pounds has been pledged in donations by an online forum to the Yorkshire Air Ambulance.
Hammond remains in a serious but stable condition.
Now, I've covered most of what happened here in my Richard Hammond documentary, and I'll cover it in even more detail whenever I do get round to my Series 9 retrospective. But basically, Top Gear found themselves in a literal crisis situation. Richard Hammond had just been involved in a near-fatal accident that had very nearly killed him. He'd been plunged into a coma with no guarantee of ever waking up. The show's detractors had finally been given all the ammunition they needed to take the programme off the air, to the point even reruns and best-of compilations had been wiped from the schedule as official investigations were conducted into the cause of the accident. And in the days where access to media coverage wasn't as absolute as it is today, particularly online, Final Gear became an invaluable resource for the latest concrete developments on Hammond's condition and the fate of the Top Gear program going forward. 2 days following the accident, Alex Mills would take it upon himself to launch a recovery fund for Richard Hammond, as well as signal-boosting Pistonheads' fund of a similar nature. Within 48 hours, the website would independently raise over $1,000 from generous contributors, and you do have to remember that this was all the way back in 2006, which arguably makes it all the more impressive. But herein lay the problem. What meaningful act could Final Gear do that none of the other fundraisers were already doing? It therefore turned to Sacramento-based Final Gear member Jacob Fox, who put together 7 options for every other member of the forum to vote on, one of these being a custom-designed crash helmet. This option was greatly favoured over the others as it was something not only personal but practical as well. The helmet would cost around £220 to £250 to create, and Jason Fowler's team at JLF Designs would be commissioned to make the helmet. The main design of a hamster driving an orange Pagani Zonda, Hammond's favourite car, and representing the vehicle he drove in Series 7's French road trip, would be designed by forum member Wufflepuff, whereas the motifs of a stylised fighting hamster head would be designed by Al Murray, who was Alex Mills' sister. The two elements would then be combined by Berserker Catsplat, and the final helmet then made real by Fowler's team. Now the hard part was getting the helmet to its eventual recipient, which was especially troublesome if no one on the forum had a direct connection to the BBC. This is where Australian member FBC comes in. You see, FBC was one of the masterminds behind the satirical automotive blog Sniff Petrol, and it was FBC who would help coordinate the design of the helmet along with its subsequent creation, before FBC's mystery contact worked his magic in alerting the Top Gear team to what Final Gear were doing. By the beginning of May 2007, Hammond would receive the helmet along with a bucket load of well wishes. What perhaps greatly helped matters in this respect even more was that on the 9th of February it was revealed that Andy Willman was a regular visitor of the website, and although subsequent research indicates it was most likely Ian Morris who ran the show's Final Gear account, it is more than possible it was also lent to Willman at some point. Now, as per strict BBC protocol, the show was not allowed to mention where the helmet had come from, but Richard Hammond was sure to leave his appreciation in a signed photograph. He claimed that he loved the helmet and would always wear it from that point on. The helmet would then indeed reappear 3 episodes later as part of the Motorhome Race Challenge, although in actuality, it had been filmed 2 months earlier. Sadly, this helmet would somehow go missing not long after its appearance in the Bugatti v Typhoon film, and supposedly no one in the Top Gear team knows where it went. It didn't burn in the Hill End bonfire, in case you're wondering, as that had happened 3 weeks prior to the Bugatti vs Typhoon film. The best case scenario is Hammond took it home and simply misplaced it, because to think of anything else would be to assume the worst of people. 2007 to 2008 would likely prove to be the most successful year ever for Final Gear. The website was no longer one of the internet's big secrets. The word was officially out, especially with the handover of Hammond's helmet, and on the 16th of February 2007, the website's first ever real-world in-person meet would be announced at the Nürburgring. 3 months later, on the 20th of May 2007, 9 members of Final Gear plus 2 of their close friends would actually make the trip, meeting Sabina Schmitz in the process. And this wasn't just a one-time thing, mind you. These meetings would continue on an annual basis every single year for the next decade thereafter, growing bigger and more numerous every single time. This clearly then inspired the rest of the forum, and before long, meets were announced in every corner of the globe. In Frankfurt, Australia, at Silverstone during the very same weekend as that year's Britcar 24-hour race, and perhaps most importantly of all, at Flat Rock Speedway in Michigan. At the end of September, well-known forum members Quickie and Sarah Jaden, along with their friends, would take receivership of a battered BMW 5 Series and decorate it with the Final Gear logo to represent the forums during the famed 24 Hours of Lemons race. The car would perform decently on the track, making it to the end of the race with a high position of 12th, and as per custom, its driver would be tarred and feathered during the post-race proceedings. This wouldn't be the only time they'd enter the race, as they'd form a regular presence at Lemons events for the next several years, perhaps its most high-profile appearances coming in 2010, when they obtained the supercharged Pontiac Grand Prix. In August 2008, Final Gear would expand its social media presence, creating accounts on Facebook and Twitter, and it wasn't long before some very talented people launched the website's first merchandise, a range of t-shirts. In fact, as I record this video, I'm even wearing a shirt issued by Final Gear, the Careless Air shirt, which remains perpetually available on redbubble.com. Now, I'd like to say I have a lot of memories with this shirt, but truth be told, I literally just bought it for this video, though I'll certainly be wearing it in the future. As the years wore on, Final Gear continued to grow ever more massive. When I got my first home computer setup in 2006, Final Gear, along with the classic Top Gear site with all its many Flash games, were probably among the websites I visited the most. Indeed, by the end of the decade, Final Gear was practically synonymous with Top Gear's online presence despite having zero connection to the BBC, with the website breaking all-time traffic records on the 21st of June 2009, the same night that Top Gear came back for its 13th series in United Kingdom, and this was in part thanks to many more thousands of people in the UK being made aware of the website due to a small feature in the March issue of Top Gear magazine. The production team would therefore extend an olive branch towards Mills and the website, as on the 19th of January 2011, he'd be invited to attend the inaugural studio sessions for Top Gear's 16th series, during which he'd get a photograph with presenter Richard Hammond. No doubt this increased publicity then helped Mills to land his dream job at a firm called Automatic at roughly the same time, during which he'd spend 9 months as an intern before being promoted to full-time employee. But with Mininova shutting down in November 2009, Final Gear remained the main method in which people from all over the world watched Top Gear. It was perhaps for this reason as to why, beginning from August 2007, BBC America would officially announce that Top Gear had been picked up to form a core part of its Anglophenia programming block moving forward, although it would take them quite some time to catch up to the latest episodes. Furthermore, unlike the UK, the BBC name was merely being used under license by AMC, and was not a major broadcasting presence as it is in the UK. This meant not everyone could access the channel. Indeed, as late as 2011, there were over 30 million US households which could not receive the station, the most notable of these being New York City's Cablevision. It also certainly didn't stop piracy of Top Gear in the slightest, since torrenting the episodes still remains the best way to watch the original uncut episodes in most of the world. Because of this, Final Gear was still costing channels like BBC America millions of dollars every single year. Something had to be done. On the 24th of October 2013, Final Gear would rather joyously commemorate its 10th anniversary, but on the 3rd of July the following year, the website would meet its judgment day.
Dear Sir, Madam, BBC Worldwide Consumer Products has received information that the domain listed above, which appears to be on servers under your control, is offering unlicensed copies of, or is engaged in other unauthorized activities relating to copyrighted works owned by BBC Worldwide Consumer Products. We hereby give notice of these activities to you and request that you take expeditious action to remove or disable access to the material described above, and thereby prevent the unauthorized distribution of the works via your company's network. We appreciate your cooperation in this matter. Yours sincerely, Peter O'Rourke, Director of Intelligence and Investigations Federation.
And with that, Final Gear as a platform for obtaining the latest episodes of Top Gear was officially over, to some outcry from various motor journalism outlets. To be brutally honest, it wasn't as bad as I remember it, given that the front page was now 9 years old owing to an aborted planned revamp several years earlier, and admittedly it's almost surreal seeing such an old-looking website reference Jeremy Clarkson's 2018 contract extension, which ultimately never came to materialise in the wake of his fracas just a few months later. But even with his website crippled, at the end of the day its founder was still a person with goals and dreams and ambitions. From as far back as April 2003, when he'd caught one in the flesh for the very first time, Alex Mills's dream car had been the third-generation Dodge Viper convertible. Ever since he was a boy, he adored the original Dodge Viper to the point he chose it to represent his online presence. And yet, he had never driven one. And the reason he had never driven one is the very same reason he hadn't attended any of the ring meets or participated in any of the website's Lemons attempts. Despite being 26 years old, Alex Mills had never learned to drive. Now, don't laugh, as I myself am in the very same boat as Mills, albeit not down to lack of interest so much as years of underlying health issues, but with whatever reasons Mills had for not learning how to drive in his teenage years, he obviously wanted to change that. And so, after using his mother's automatic transmission Honda Civic to pass his driving test during the opening months of the year, on the 16th of May 2011, he would inherit his very first car, a 1988 Chevrolet Corsica, from his father. Nicknamed the Crapsica, Mills had decided to take the ailing Chevy off his father's hands for one simple reason. Given that it was a manual, he wanted something cheap and nasty to practice his pedal work with, so he wouldn't burn out the clutch on something that was actually nice. With that said, between the car and Mills himself, the latter only 4 years older, it was quite easy to see that time had been much kinder to one over the other. Despite residing in the most England-like climate in the entire United States and having only covered 122,000 miles, its clear coat had failed spectacularly and had since been rattle-canned over. That was probably the least of its issues. Before Mills even got a chance to drive it, they had to put in a new steering column from a junked car to replace the factory original, as it had shorted out. What's more, when he stopped to put in some petrol for the first time, it turned out the filler hose leaked fuel, leaving a nice flammable pool all over the gas station floor. Between May and July of 2011, Alex Mills would drive the crapsicker up and down the mean streets of Portland, practicing his clutch control on both flat surfaces and inclines, to the point that come mid-July, hills didn't so much as bother him anymore. Finally, by the 20th of July, Mills had had enough of the Chevy and its anemic 2.8-litre V6. And given that his 27th birthday was coming up, he wanted to rapidly move up market. After consulting the rest of his forum's active user base, he finally settled on this, a 2001 Ford Mustang GT in laser red. The timing of this was rather fortuitous, as Mills had just purchased a mic cover stick for his GoPro and wanted to see how much it reduced wind noise by. The answer? Not very much. But the Mustang was far more than just a very expensive addition for his GoPro. For the first time in his 27 years, Alex Mills was behind the wheel of a car he had no doubt grown up admiring. It wasn't his favourite car in the world, but it was an important milestone in his life, and after 3 months of ownership, Mills made his first real impulse buy, a set of vanity plates. What were these personalised plates, perchance? I'm Stig, a tasteful reference to the tamed racing driver of his favourite ever TV show. But as nice as his Mustang was, Alex Mills's online pseudonym was never Mustang 007 Bond. And so, on the 17th of January 2012, Mills would buy his third and final car, a 2008 Dodge Viper SRT10 convertible in blue, said example having covered a little under 10,000 miles at the time of his purchase, and he had paid a smidge under $63,000 for. Finally, on the 23rd of March, 2 months later, Mills's dream car would arrive. He'd spend the entire first day with his Viper on the road, clocking up 70 miles, most of them off the freeway, and burning half a tank of petrol in the process. This news tied in rather nicely with the Final Gear forum's launch of its worldwide care package, where after careful consideration it had been decided to send a 1/64 scale model of a blue Dodge Viper all around the world. And it would all start in the gift shop of the Mercedes-Benz Museum near the Nürburgring by a forum user named Thomas. Over the next 3 years it would travel all over the world, soon being joined by a similar model of an Alfa Romeo Alfetta, the pair racking up 20 countries on 4 continents in short order, including being in London during the time of the Olympics, visiting Viper's home state of Oregon, and even a tour of Australia's Bathurst circuit when in the possession of forum regular Gerardine, aka Miserabelle. During her ownership of the car, it also got playfully mauled by a kangaroo at the Featherdale Wildlife Park as part of its final stop in the country. Its last known whereabouts on the Little Toy Viper Twitter page was during its second visit to the UK, where thanks to ardent photographer and Lotus Elise owner Helen Convery, it was put on a ship to Iceland. What happened after that is sadly rather anticlimactic. Whilst being sent to Switzerland, the cars were snatched out of the package, and where they went after that is not known. On the 18th of September 2011, prominent Slovenian Final Gear member Icebone would set up Final Gear's official YouTube channel, originally to centralise coverage of the annual ring meets in addition to other meetings around the world. Now, for the most part, the videos on this channel aren't particularly anything to write home about, and many of them don't even have 1,000 views in total. But there is one video on that channel which I think stands out from the rest, and 200,000 people seem to agree. Its name is Young at Heart, and whereas like most of the other videos, Icebone would film and edit it, it would instead be written and presented by British Final Gear member MWF, Matthew Harvey, with Icebone, real name Darian Platinovsek, overseeing its production. Here is a 90-second excerpt of that video, although I strongly recommend you go to the FGTV YouTube channel and watch it in full, because it is 8 minutes of some of the most profound, well-thought-out motor journalism I've ever personally watched that didn't come out from any of the major broadcasting networks.
You know, it's quite scary to think, but the car's been with us now for 130 years. Colin Chapman had a mantra, simplify and add lightness. Sadly, I think it got buried with him. I bet his grave looks like Tornado Alley. What I've found is this. It's a 1989 BMW 325i. And if you're looking at it and you're wondering if I really have gone back in time, there's a damn good reason for that. My friend Alish has spent 3 years and many euros taking this thing right back to bare bones and putting it back together. I could stare at this thing for hours, but it needs to be on the road, don't you think? on these stunning Croatian roads. It darts, it dives, carves into corners, cuts through bends like a plasma cutter through plasticine. God, I love this thing. I want to check it in on the flight home. Or maybe just nick it and drive back. That would be good.
Quite honestly, it is brilliant. Even though it's only 8 minutes long and filmed presumably with the budget of an empty Tic Tac box, it quite honestly feels more like the Top Gear of old than anything the BBC otherwise unceremoniously shit out after 2015, and it's a crying shame that this is the only production like this on the entire Final Gear TV channel. Had the channel made more videos like this, received some sort of funding, and had they just been a couple of years later to the party, we may be speaking of FGTV in the same breath as Car Throttle, Car Wow and Throttle House, among various other big-name car tuber groups with increasingly unimaginative names, not including yours truly, since I'm not a group. I'm certainly no frontman, contrary to popular belief. Returning to Alex Mills, he'd spend the summer of 2012 putting literally thousands upon thousands of miles on his new Dodge Viper, which quickly surpassed 10,000 miles by the 20th of April and over 14,500 by the beginning of September, when he chose to begin his most ambitious journey yet. A 16-day, 3,000-mile West Coast road trip from Mills's home in Portland, Oregon, all the way down to San Diego in California and back, heading north through Las Vegas and Reno, Nevada, and finishing up at Multnomah Falls back in Oregon, a place that had fascinated Mills for much of his life. 1 month earlier, that August, Alex Mills would also coordinate a Final Gear-themed road trip, 400 miles through the heart of Washington's Cascade Loop. Initially, Mills was rather pessimistic over just how many of the forum's user base would join in, given it wasn't a very big road trip, and by its very nature, the majority of Final Gear's user base was located in Europe. In the end, over 35 members of Final Gear and their close friends, many of whom at least casually browsed the forums, would join in, representing all creed of car enthusiasts, from a Camry to a Countach. Even now, all these years later, these photos are just so wonderful to see again. Just a bunch of guys and gals from all around the world, or at least the Pacific Northwest, who each met each other through their shared love of a British TV programme. That October, Mills would be sent an advance copy of Playground's first Forza Horizon title, for which the cover star was, rather naturally, the new Dodge Viper. In the span of 7 years, Mills had gone from buying a copy of Gran Turismo 4 out of his own pocket to being gifted a copy of Forza Horizon for free. And as all this was going on, things could only get better throughout the next 3 years. Starting from the following July, Mills would begin taking his car to track days and autocross events, and in little time at all, after a small handful of rookie errors, frequently found himself near the top of the timesheets, including the fastest run of the day on only his 4th ever outing in June 2015. 3 months earlier, he'd also attend the American launch of the LaFerrari Holy Trinity hypercar, perhaps ticking off yet another of his childhood dreams. Final Gear as a community was still thriving, even if what it had first cut its teeth on, torrents of Top Gear episodes, was no more. In truth, Final Gear didn't need such torrents to curry such an audience these days. That was just a nice bonus that lasted a good 8 or 9 years longer than Alex Mills or any of the website's other venerated staff had earnestly anticipated. There was now a stable YouTube channel which Icebone managed, a pair of toy cars working their way around the world, and a ton of meets happening across America and Europe, with the annual August ring meet at the Nordschleife of course the biggest one. But despite being the biggest and oldest meeting in Final Gear's history, having been held a total of 8 times, there had been one glaring omission the entire time: Alex Mills himself. In 2015, that would all change. With Icebone at the wheel of his ever-trusty Audi A4, he'd take Viper for a lap around the world's most fearsome circuit. And what was Mills' opinion of the whole thing?
That was awesome.
Throughout the rest of the weekend, he'd keep a relatively low profile, although he does show up in some of the photo and video material recorded by others. During the awards ceremony, you can just about see Mills to the far left and a couple rows back, so as not to detract from everyone else's presence. One thing I do find important to reiterate here is that everyone you see in this video are just some of the faces who each populated Final Gear's forums in the 2000s and 2010s. Before joining that forum, none of these people knew each other. This was a community that had been truly bred from the ground up over the previous 12 years, and I just find the idea of that beautiful.
And seeing as you have an oily, smelly vag, have some pussy.
Upon his return to the States, Mills would partake in yet more autocross events, and put his Dodge on a dyno to see just how many of his Viper's horses had escaped over the previous 8 years. With cars and coffee starting to become a worldwide phenomenon at this point, it wouldn't be long before Portland had its own chapter, with Mills becoming a frequent attendee, especially after being captivated by an unimog of all vehicles that YouTuber Vanagon had brought along to the earliest known event Mills attended in late 2013. In October 2015, Alex would be joined by his father in his Triumph TR250, very likely the same car he had owned since the younger Mills was a teenager. On the 2nd of March 2016, possibly spurred on by the power his car had lost over the years, Alex Mills would cave to temptation and impulsively buy a brand new performance exhaust for his Dodge Viper. That May, he'd also head down south to Arizona for yet another Dodge Viper meet, and 1 month after that, he'd take a few laps of the famed Maryhill Loops Road in Washington. But alas, the good times couldn't last forever. For this penultimate part of the video, I really had to compose myself. I apologize in advance if it is not as thorough as something like this ought to be. In 2006, the rap artist and composer Jay Dilla, formerly of Farside, would release the solo album Donuts a mere 3 days before he passed. Now this wasn't prophetic, he'd known his ticket had been punched years earlier, owing to his worsening condition, but the important thing is he didn't use that as an excuse to pout and do nothing whatsoever with the time that he had left. Metaphorically, he got his album released with only 3 donuts left in his box. He chose not to let them go mouldy out of spite, because if he did, all the hard work that went into making those donuts goes to waste. On the 10th of October 2016, barely 2 weeks after the Grand Tour's launch party in the Mojave Desert, Alex Mills didn't feel right. No appetite, a light fever, and shortness of breath. But he wasn't on death's door, not yet at least, and wrote the whole thing off as a minor seasonal thing, something that would go away after a few days. But by the 18th, he was still ill, and out of concern for his health, visited his doctor. He'd have blood work taken that morning and thought little of it for the rest of the day. That evening, he'd receive a life-changing phone call. You see, the normal leukocyte count for a body fighting a simple infection was around 12,000 white blood cells. Mills had 94,000. This was not only 8 times higher than the typical figure, but also the highest Mills' doctor had ever personally recorded in a patient. Over the next 2 to 3 days, Mills would be made to undergo several tests, including a painful bone marrow biopsy, but by the 21st, his doctor's greatest fears were made real. Alex Mills had been diagnosed with leukemia. He would spend the next 45 days in hospital undergoing an intense course of chemotherapy. He foresaw a winter without driving his beloved Dodge Viper, although it was already snowing by that point, and updated his worrisome fanbase with the news that he'd need to check into the hospital once or twice every few weeks thereafter, followed by a bone marrow transplant several months later. Sadly, neither of his sisters were a match. His next update would come on the 27th of April the following year. He acknowledged that the 100 days following his operation would be among the hardest of his life, and his mother would bravely step up to the challenge of helping him through the tough times which lay ahead. The last time he'd drive his Dodge Viper, at least for a while, was at an autocross event in March 2017, where it appears he turned up simply to launch his car off the line, rather than partake in any of the competition. His operation would initially prove a success, and he subsequently spent most of May 2017 hooked up to an IV as his body fought one valiant battle after another. He'd be discharged at the end of the month, and for the next 3 months after that, things seemed to be improving. But then in August, he started feeling weaker again. Blood work would indeed sadly confirm that his leukemia had relapsed and had mutated as a result of the chemotherapy. By early September, he'd be back in hospital, bedridden just as ever, and this meant for the first time since starting his job with Automatic 8 years earlier, he'd missed the annual corporate photo. But his co-workers certainly hadn't forgotten him. And so, spurred on by this, he kept fighting. On the 22nd of January 2018, he'd issue his followers with yet another update. Exactly 2 months earlier, around Thanksgiving, Mills had received his second stem cell transplant, and things would actually continue to go so well that in spite of having bouts of graft versus host disease, by December he'd start working again. By February, he'd even start to return to something of a normal life. In the span of just 2 days, from the 17th to the 18th, he'd launch a new plugin for WordPress titled Smart Crop, which dealt with image thumbnails, and he'd start his Dodge Viper for the first time in over 11 months. Things were looking up. On the 11th of March 2018, he'd go out for a drive with his close friends, marking one of the first times since late 2016 that he'd driven his Viper anywhere. He'd even start making preparations to move back into his house after spending a year at his mother's. But then, beginning from April, the disease would start its latest counterattack, one that would sadly prove terminal. It would start with irreversible macular damage to Alex Mills's eyes that he managed to adapt to, followed by meningitis in June. By July, his leukemia would relapse for a third time. He'd celebrate his 34th birthday on something of a morose note, and by the 5th of October, following 2 28-day courses of powerful immunotherapy, he once again found himself in remission. With his vision somewhat healed, although never to what it was, he once more began his return to normalcy and thought about driving again, having last taken his Viper for a spin 6 months earlier that April. Unfortunately, it just wasn't to be. On the 30th of November, Mills would be diagnosed with leukemia for the 4th time. He'd remain in as good spirits as he possibly could, and by January 2019, reassured his fanbase that his condition was under control to the best of his or anyone else's ability. On the 29th of that month, a plugin he'd designed, Regenerate Thumbnails, would surpass 10 million downloads. That was probably the final bit of good news he ever had in his life. Throughout late January, he'd undergo several tests and had discovered that his leukemia had mutated once again. Over the next 3 weeks, Mills and his doctors would try their absolute hardest, but the damage, particularly to his liver, was far too great, and by the 18th, the war was sadly very much a foregone conclusion, the disease nothing more than a disgraced victor. 9 days later, on the 27th of February 2019, Alex Mills would succumb to his illness, surrounded by his family. And on that day, I think a small part of every Top Gear fan in the world died at the same time. Yet, for the BBC's Top Gear, it was seemingly business as usual that day, with no tributes issued on either their website or their Twitter account. And in a way, I do find that a terrible shame. They'd issue a tribute to John Haynes, author and creator of the eponymous car manuals which bear his name just mere days earlier, and yet it was crickets for a man who meant so much to Top Gear, who had meant so much to us, and for whom Top Gear had meant so much to him. Yet rather disappointingly, it seemed no prominent Top Gear personality, be they producer, presenter, or indeed scriptwriter, spoke openly about Mills's demise. All except for one. Jeremy Clarkson. Unbeknownst to probably anyone, Clarkson had followed Alex Mills in his Final Gear project for years, and considered his work of utmost importance to the worldwide success of Top Gear. And I think that is an honour far greater than any sort of dreary obituary typed up by an oblivious intern. At the time of Mills's death, only half of the third series of the Grand Tour had had the time to air. Although principal photography had wrapped in late 2018, it is therefore sadly very unlikely that Mills had the chance to watch the last ever episodes of the Grand Tour. But without knowing for sure, I personally like to believe that the team made an effort in allowing him to live out his final days watching their last adventures before anyone else had the chance to. It's what he deserved. As one of Mills's final wishes, in the days which followed his tragic passing, a close friend of his and Porsche enthusiast by the name of Marcelo Azeredo would take ownership of his Viper, and although his local Cars and Coffee chapter typically turned their noses up at such miscreant behaviour, at Mills's posthumous instruction, Azeredo would dump the clutch and let rip all 533 horses at once, shredding the rear tyres of the Viper in one spectacular, glorious burnout. Said chapter would then announce on the 19th of March that every meeting henceforth would feature an empty section of parking lot reserved just for him, Alex's lot, to be filled only on special occasions and when events overflowed. Later on in the year, that August, he'd be honoured with a day dedicated to him by the Wilsonville chapter of Cars and Coffee on what would have been 1 week after Mills's 35th birthday. On the 12th of April 2019, the final regular episode of the Grand Tour would go to air. Many would be moved by the show's tribute to the Ford family saloon's final incarnation, and more still were moved by Clarkson's tearful visage at the end of 17 glorious years, with two of the best co-presenters any leading man could ever hope to wish for. But I was particularly moved by this episode for a completely different reason, because like much how Jeremy Clarkson had spoken up for Richard Burns on a day that everyone and their dog chose to mourn Georgie best, this was, in a way, a funeral for Alex Mills. This was not just saying goodbye to epoxy blue-collar saloon. This was not just saying goodbye to one of the greatest televisual legacies ever forged. This was saying goodbye to a man for whom without him, Top Gear and the Grand Tour wouldn't have encountered anywhere near as much success as they did. I myself never got to speak with Mills during his life, having only joined the forum a month after his passing at the end of well over a decade of lurking. But on that day, we each said one last goodbye to a man we all considered our friend.
Marcelo, when I say light it up, I want you to light it up and stand Alex off in style. 1, 2, 3. Light it up!
Without Alex Mills, Top Gear simply wouldn't have a fandom. He is the show's one true unsung hero, the name that isn't on the credits of any episode, the name that is never spoken aloud by any of the on-screen talent, but it's a name that all of us, as Top Gear fans, should know by heart. And this closing chapter of this video is going to talk about why a TV show having a fandom is not only important, but that it should never be overlooked or scoffed at. Fandom doesn't just keep a piece of media alive, it gives it new life. Decades after a show finishes airing or a serial stops publishing, it can still thrive with zero additional material in much the same way a bottle terrarium does, because ordinary people like you and me care enough to build something out of it. And to me, that's a beautiful thing. Even if those fans end up bringing nothing new to the table, just talking about something is enough to spur renewed interest in that property, and you're looking at the proof right here. But don't take my word for it. Take the 2002 freeware title Janae Rally, for instance, a game you've probably never heard of, which I did make a video about back in 2022 on my second channel that I'd very much like for you to go back and watch, even if it isn't as polished as my later works. Because it is probably the foremost shining example of something being kept alive purely through the adoration, dedication, and determination of its fanbase. The reason its source code was tracked down with little to no contact details available and the game finally updated after 7 years of nothing was because people cared. A sequel was commissioned, thrust into development hell for over a decade, and eventually released to critical acclaim, all because people cared. And if you are someone fortunate enough to work on a piece of media that people choose to devote such a large part of themselves to, even in the smallest capacity, the very last thing you should ever do is condemn anyone who is still talking about it. Even if they critique it. Even if they misunderstand what went on because they don't have the same hands-on personal experience that you do. When a prominent creative force such as a show's scriptwriter decides to launch into a tirade over members of their own fanbase who only ever meant well, it kills people like me on the inside. Not only because there was always the option of not saying anything at all if you had absolutely nothing nice to say, but in doing so only demonstrates that you just don't fully understand and appreciate the impact of what you made to the extent that people like me are still making popular videos about it to this day. Fans create a second life for a media property that no studio, no publisher, no broadcaster could ever hope to manufacture on demand, because if the finished product just doesn't resonate with the most important audience of all, the people, then every single one of their efforts were for naught. No BBC executive ever asked Alex Mills, some random pimply-faced teenager from Oregon, to set up Final Gear. Truthfully, there are probably many within the BBC and their legal team who wished that he hadn't, But for the rest of us, it's so wonderful that he did, because he gave us a stable foundation with which to build an entire fan base on. It's his work that got Top Gear on more television sets, computer monitors, and battered iPod displays than the BBC's sluggish reaction in the face of impending worldwide superstardom ever likely wrought. And what Alex Mills's work ultimately proved in the criminally short time he had on this earth is that Top Gear was a show that truly resonated with the people. Decades from now, after thousands of other shows have had their time in the sun, Top Gear will continue to live on, and as history has shown us time and time again, it will be talked about by generations of people who weren't even born the day it all ended. Moreover, for those who didn't quite catch it, when I titled this video "The Man Who Saved Top Gear," I wasn't being facetious for the sake of views. The show would certainly have endured without an American fan base, but it was that one night in October 2003 when two people, separated by over 5,000 miles of communication cables, made the fateful decision to talk about Top Gear. Alex Mills chose to save those first few episodes of the show that VUK sent to him to his hard drive, and in doing so, he saved Top Gear. And yet, as momentous as that decision ended up becoming, at the end of the day, he and those who chose to follow his efforts for the next 16 years were nothing more than fans. Alex Mills was an avid fan who only ever wanted to see more of this fascinating little car program that just wasn't being shown in his corner of the world, which forced him and those around him to resort to piracy. And ultimately, many of us who call ourselves fans are historically justified in our compulsion for these series. If it wasn't for the fans, Monty Python would have completely rotted away on discarded videotapes instead of being given a second chance on American public access TV. We'd still remember their films, their studio albums and live performances, and know that they must have been a big deal in their time, but we'd have no real idea as to why they became famous in the first place without that original 20 hours of context provided by that TV program. Plus, if it wasn't for one very big fan in the form of Beatle George Harrison, The Life of Brian would never have been filmed. So fans are undeniably important, as they are the glue that helps to bind creators with your average Joe. But this has never been truer for anything quite like Top Gear. For Top Gear, fans like us quite literally helped to shape the direction the program evolved in, whether for better or worse. Fans are the reason people like VUK and his brother, wherever they may be today, spent 30 Sundays and Mondays a year with a TV tuner card plugged into their computer's PCIe slots as they sacrificed thousands of hours of their lives so that millions more of us could watch these shows the way they were meant to be enjoyed. Fans are the reason the BBC even bothered to get Discovery airing the episodes in the USA before properly launching BBC America, where it soon became a flagship show. Fans are the reason the BBC realised that they needed to create YouTube channels for their most popular shows, including Top Gear. Fans are the reason the Yorkshire Air Ambulance got another helicopter in the wake of Richard Hammond's accident. Fans are the reason that Hammond then got his own unique crash helmet created and donated to him by the very forum that Alex Mills had built. Fans are the reason it beat the Celebrity Big Brother 5 final in a tremendous upset that saw it become BBC Two's most watched programme ever for 307 straight weeks. Fans are the reason the show would be hand-picked by the BBC to get their HD treatment before anything else on the network. Fans are the reason that Top Gear closed out the decade as the nation's #1 show. Fans are the reason it made up to £150 million every single year and sold out stadiums all over the world. Fans, a million of them, including myself, are the reason we didn't all side with the BBC and chose to show solidarity with a man who was experiencing the worst week of his life. Fans are the reason the Grand Tour exists. Fans are the reason this video exists, and not just metaphorically, across every level. This is a video about a fan, made by a fan, funded by the fans, and produced for the fans. 50,000 of them. That's why the fan-made reviews and long-form videos and fan edits and montages, the memes and the serious deep dives into production history, every single one of these matter in their own special way. They're not just content people like us put out on a whim simply for the hell of it. They prove that a show like Top Gear is truly timeless and still resonates all these years later. And honestly, that's the greatest compliment any work of art could ever hope for. So, for next time, while you sit in an air-conditioned studio and blather on for 2 hours about a program you helped to make, largely buoyed by verbatim paragraphs from a 10-year-old autobiography you wrote, please take a minute to think about the millions of smaller guys for whom, without us, you quite frankly wouldn't be in that studio. Preferably before you end up saying something incredibly immature and inconsiderate. Because the worst thing that can happen to a piece of media such as Top Gear isn't when someone like me thinks he knows better than a person who actually worked on it to the point the latter has a borderline crash out on a podcast, and this is quite simply because fans are not, and never will be, the enemy of a legacy. They are its caretakers. We are its caretakers. Because what truly harms a legacy is when those with real pull in the community voluntarily choose to distance themselves from people like us, as though there is a seemingly untouchable factor about what we choose to do with your work, as though we're simply not good enough to be allowed to hold our own interpretations of it. And if you are that sort of person who watches videos like these and they end up affecting you on a personal level to the point it makes your blood run cold, then the sincerest, most heartfelt advice I can give to that person is for that person to just get off the internet, retire to the real world, and decide just how much more of his life he honestly wants to waste denigrating the very hard work I've put into building this channel from nothing, all the while bringing its public image into disrepute. And if the fans then decide that those remarks are the sort of thing they are okay with in their community, then I just don't want to be a part of said community. Because above all else, I just don't find that sort of conduct acceptable. It hurts me, it hurts those I personally care about, and it hurts the potential success of this channel going forward when such a pivotal voice in Top Gear's vast and storied history decides to repeatedly badmouth me and the content I produce. But even so, regardless of what might have been said, the half that individual represents in regards to the overall story of Top Gear is nonetheless important. Because without that half, I basically wouldn't have a career. Without certain books and interviews, I would have close to nothing to go off of in the videos I produce outside of journo gossip. Their side of the story is always important, and I want to make that plain. But as the saying goes, there are always two sides to every story, and what my videos represent is the other side of Top Gear, the less tangible half. The half that is hardly ever written down or talked about that I hope to have brought to you, the viewer, over the past 90 minutes. Because it really isn't that difficult to see why my videos continue to prove popular year upon year, and you are quite frankly stupid if you cannot see how much of a net positive they are to the overall Top Gear fandom. They explore a side of the TG program and its history in ways very few have done, or indeed very few can tell you. I have poured in tens of thousands of hours of research, poring over millions of words of literature, to make sure that my knowledge towards Top Gear is among the greatest of anyone who didn't actually work on it. Every single claim I make and every single video I produce is backed up by many months of prior research, and I never say things without making sure I have done my due diligence beforehand. I read every single magazine excerpt, book page, press release, and candid interview I can get my hands on to make sure that every last word I bring to the screen is as factually sound as it can possibly be. And yes, while I do occasionally make the odd mistake or clerical error, you do have to realize I am a one-man operation, and subsequently choosing to judge my entire body of work based on one or two minor nitpicks doesn't really help anyone. It just kind of makes you come off a ginormous twat. And when you then choose to follow that up with nonsensical takes such as why we supposedly hated Chris Evans, or that Eddie Jordan wasn't ever considered a main Top Gear presenter, it really just demonstrates how out of touch you are with your own fanbase, and you really need to start considering that you might be the problem. But at the end of the day, if you are going to critique the work I produce, then at least try to do so in a fair and constructive manner. It costs nothing. Go after the major points. Back up what you say with non-anecdotal stuff that can actually be verified. Demonstrate that I have not created a video satisfactory to your standards, and I will try my hardest to listen. But if all you're going to do is tear down my work via inconsequential details and then slag me off, then yeah, I'm going to lose my temper. Because you're hurting the success of my channel to satisfy your own ego, which does not need to be blown up any further than it already is. Now, as individuals, you're not required to like every single one of us. You are more than free to not watch videos such as the ones I create and divine your own meaning from Top Gear, especially if you were part of the program's creative force. But without us, and I'm saying this with all the best will in the world, you wouldn't be half the star you think you are. Because as someone as intrinsic to Top Gear's success a certain individual might be, who has the opportunity to spread good word of those who produce works like mine, even if they do so in a misguided capacity, this is what he ultimately chooses to use his platform for? That we don't matter, that YouTube should not be a place for people like us, rank amateurs making videos out of our council estate bedrooms, and who'd never get a day in show business without endlessly brown-nosing or fulfilling all of the discriminatory hiring policies in place at companies like the BBC nowadays, that it should instead be the domain for yesterday's news, who may be able to crank out far more polished videos than my more modest bag of tricks could ever hope to muster, but are missing the one key ingredient: heart. No, you don't get to do that, because if you do, you spit on the memory of people like Alex Mills. Because as a person, Mills was a fighter to the bitter end. He ignored the threats of his greatest adversary and tried to continue with normal life as much as he could, writing plugins and driving his Viper whenever he felt up to it, even if just revving the engine physically exhausted him. By starting up his Viper, he was mocking the very same thing that was killing him. He didn't admit defeat during the last 2.5 years of his life, even if it was offered to him as a gesture of mercy. He smashed that disease with every last fibre of his being until there was nothing left to give. He kicked its ass 3 times in succession. That's 3 more than most of us will ever hopefully have to experience. He was far more than just a moderator of a pirate Top Gear fan site, and I want people to know that. For me, Alex Mills was, and always will be, a legend. This year, I really want to start growing Gearknob beyond what it presently is. I've started an Instagram page that I would appreciate anyone watching to follow, and as I'm now firmly on the road to 100,000 subscribers, I'm henceforth going to try my hardest to reach that goal. In time, it would certainly be on my agenda to reach out to former Top Gear personnel to help further bridge the gap between the fans and the creative figures, but given what's happened since 2023, I just don't ever see that happening, given at least one individual probably doesn't want to be in the same studio with someone who's actually going to be asking them some hardball questions. Ultimately, we shall see. But if you did enjoy what you watched, then please consider supporting the channel and my efforts in any way you can, as Gearknob is a completely independent channel not funded by any large corporation, and I very much aim to keep it that way for as long as I possibly can. Thank you all very much for bearing with me during this turbulent time, and I sincerely hope to see you all in the next video. Take care.